Incandescent Lion Blond Ezel surely is an iconic unit, one that I personally took a liking to when I saw it back in Asia Circuit years ago at this point. Wasn't particularly good back then, but I really enjoyed playing it in Zero, where it definitely was a lot better, and to finally have it in Standard and actually be pretty decent is super exciting for me, so I've been testing this out, and I just want to share my deck list with you all. For the ride line, run Crimson Lion Cub Criff as the starter. It is necessary for the Knight of Elegant Skills Bowman skill to have this in Soul. It's also just so iconic, but it's just our standard star, so nothing else to really say about it. For the gray one, Knight of Elegant Skills Gareth here lets us search out when rode upon by Bowman. Ezel's specific order, the Reign Supreme King of Beasts, a very strong order that I'll go over later, but just going +1 into that order feels so nice. And then for the grade 2, of course, we got the Knight of Superior Skills Bowman, that if it's on Vanguard Circle and we have Gareth and Criff and Soul, we can discard a card to ride one Blond Ezel from our ride deck, but it gets drive -1, meaning we're guaranteed to get to our grade 3 first. And as long as we're going up against anything except a mass deck going second, we're going to guarantee get Persona Ride first, which is also pretty cool. And then Ezel here has 3 skills here. First off, you cannot ride into any other cards but Ezel, that's just so you can't get to grade 3 first, get some powerful like grade 3 orders like our Reign Supreme King of Beasts or other powerful grade 3 rear guards, and then just switch off to any boss card like we normally would as if we were just riding up standard. So that makes a lot of sense, but the real meat and potatoes of this card is that at the beginning of your ride phase, if there are 3 or less unit cards on your board, you can Soul Blast 1 to check top 3, choose up to 1 grade 3 or less unit card from among them, call it to an open rearguard circle, and put the rest on the bottom of your deck in any order. So just a great way to rebuild your board if it's been whittled down either by your own skills putting it to the bottom of the deck, or if you're against a deck that is removing pieces from your board. Really just helps make sure that you can put up that strong offense. And then on Vanguard Circle, auto, when this unit attacks a grade 3 or greater Vanguard, you can Counterblast 1, look at the top 7 cards of your deck, choose up to 2 grade 3 or less unit cards from among them, call to open rearguard circles, and this unit gets power plus 10,000 until end of turn, and you shuffle your deck. So this card creates 2 additional attacks, meaning this is a 5 attack deck. We just need to be able to clear out our front row rear guard circles to do so. And that 10k, well, at first glance, you'd rather give it to the rear guards because they're the ones multi-attacking and hitting later, meaning that there's a chance for your opponent to check triggers. That 10k for the Vanguard actually sometimes puts in a lot of work, just making it a lot hard to guard the Vanguard and not having it be a weak attack. So I don't hate that skill. It just means that the deck really needs to, in addition, clearing out your front row rear guards, also needs to be able to give power to the rear guards to be able to support their attacks. But all in all, this is a super solid card for just building a board, being offensive, and it was definitely putting a lot of work. It's honestly surprised me how good this card actually felt being played. Just because it interacts interestingly, since your opponent has to be at grade 3 or greater, you're going to have turns where you just can't multi-attack, meaning that you're not getting off its second skill here, but just being able to put up a board and make sure you can keep it up with that first skill. Honestly, a lot of times was just able to put enough pressure in so that when you are multi-attacking, it's really hard because your opponent's having to guard a lot of those attacks. Moving over to the main deck, I said power was an issue, so 3 Persona Ride copies just makes even more sense than they normally do. I mean, you run them by standard, but just giving 10 to the front row, meaning those attacks are hitting even harder here. The interesting about this deck, though, is because you're going to grade 3 a turn earlier than every single deck is, you do get Persona Ride first, but there are times where I feel like you want to save that Persona Ride for a turn when you can start multi-attacking, because this deck does filter a lot, meaning it is a bit easier to get into your Persona Rides, but also doesn't draw an insane amount, meaning that it's such hit or miss. So I'm still kind of testing how I like to do it, but that is one thing I've definitely noticed is sometimes it feels right just to hold the Persona Ride for the multi-attack turn. And also, this deck does Soul Blast a lot. I mean, to be able to use that first skill, we need a Soul Blast, so sometimes just being able to Persona Ride into it to be able to get that soul is also super beneficial, not only for Ezel, but for other cards as well. So 3 copies. I mean, it's standard, but I think it's even more important for this deck than most other decks. Moving over to the grade 2s, a great card for this deck is actually the Forefront Knight to Fault here, a fellow triple rare from set 11 that does so much for this deck. So when this unit is placed on rearguard circle, other than by unit card's ability, if you have played a normal order this turn, you can Soul Blast 1 to look at the top 5 cards of your deck, choose up to 1 card with grade less than or equal to your Vanguard's grade from among them, reveal it, call to a rearguard circle if it's a unit card, add it to your hand if it's a normal order, and you shuffle your deck. And then second skill is auto rearguard circle. When this unit attacks a grade 3 or greater unit, if you have 4 or more cards or 4 or more units, this unit gets 10,000 power until end of that battle. So this does help with the big power issue this deck has. Being able to easily gain 10k is massive. 20k swing, 30k under Persona Ride scales so nicely. And then its first skill just lets us just extend even further. This deck already runs the Reign Supreme King of Beasts order, which enables it to use this effect. And most notably, the only time this card will not be able to get the call is if it's called off of its own skill, Ezel skill, or one of our other cards, like I run the Icirrus here if we call it off of Icirrus. But off of the Reign Supreme King of Beasts, you get that effect. It gets you to extend extend even further, which is just great to build a board early on to aggress, great for card advantage, great for filtering out your deck. All in all, this card just puts in so much work. It feels like the perfect combo piece, with the only thing it really not doing is putting itself to the bottom of the deck, but we've got other cards to help out this deck with that. The next grade 2 is 3 additional copies of Knight of Superior Skills Bowman. This card, when on Rearguard Circle auto, when this unit attacks, if you have Vanguard with Ezel in its card name, you may have this unit get power plus 5,000 till end of that battle, and if you do, at the end of battle, put this unit to the bottom of your deck, and that part is mandatory. So if you give it the 5k, you mandatorily have to put it at the bottom of the deck at the end of the attack. But that's fine because we need open Rearguard circles for Ezel skill, so this clears up the circle while gaining power so it can hit some relevant numbers. All in all, super solid. I love to run this at 4 copies just to help make this deck a bit easier at clearing out those front row circles, but again, it's not until the late game, so a lot of times I'll just throw those back in deck, save them for the late game, or honestly, a lot of times I'll just throw it out on board and keep it on Rearguard circle, not using its effect unless necessary to actually hit and I want to aggress, just to save it for those scenarios. So it's another solid support card. Doesn't do as much as like the default, but it's exactly what this deck needs right now, and we don't have any other better options, so we're going to run this. Next up, I run 2 Magic of Alteration Ternar. So auto at the Rearguard circle, and then battle this unit attacked while boosted. If your damage zone has 3 or more face down cards, you may put it to soul to countercharge 1. So this is just a great way to recoup resources. It's soul for our various soul blasting effects such as Ezel and the default here, as well as countercharge. This deck does not run into too much counterblast issue, but part of that is just because this one can easily get us some counterblast back before the Ezel attacks, giving us this deck a bit more flexibility. The reason I only run 2 copies despite it being a really strong card and super synergistic card is that it's actually quite difficult to sometimes get 3 or more face down cards in your damage zone, especially early on, which can clog up your board. And that's just because in the early game, you know, you're not necessarily doing as much. You're not filtering through your deck as much to find your pieces. So there's still plenty of ways to counterblast. And also, especially in the early game, sometimes you just aren't at high damage yet. You're not at that 3 damage mark. So I found this card actually clogging up my board sometimes. So I figured 2 is fine. That way, if I find it in the late game, awesome. It's a super synergistic card. But if I find it early, like I can just discard no problem, and I'm also less likely to find it in the early game. So that was one of the big changes. I was originally running 3 from the initial deck list. I don't think it's necessarily wrong to. I just want to test out different cards in this slot. So honestly, you could easily run this at 3 to 4 copies, and in the early game, just discard it, intercept, guard with it, whatever. But again, I want to have some extra flexibility in my deck, so I'm testing out something else. And that something else is actually 2 copies of the Icirrus. If you saw my initial list from the video just breaking down all the lists of the decks I'm testing this set, you have noticed that this card was an extra copy of the Ternar, as well as an non-Elementary Sanctitude, a Gradius Gradale. But I decided I want some extra flexibility. I didn't really like the 5th order in the Gradius Gradale, and it didn't feel like Persona Ride was so necessary that I needed to run it. And a lot of times I just want to use the Reign Supreme King of Beasts. So I didn't really want to clog up my deck anymore. And Icirrus is actually a really neat way because it kind of serves that role of being able to increase the chance of finding Persona Rides. Because I did say it was very, very important, but I don't think it's so important to justify the negatives of running Gradius Gradale. But Icirrus, an old card here, but in case you don't know, when placed on Rearguard Circle, you may counterblast 1, soul blast 1 to look at the top 3 cards of your deck, choose up to 1 card from among them, reveal it, call it to Rearguard Circle if it's a grade 2 or less unit card, and put it into your hand if it is not, and shuffle your deck. So this card is super flexible, can help build a board, or if you find, say, your Ezel, you get to add it to hand, so it can help you filter out your Persona Rides. It's not the most likely because it's top 3, but also has some additional utility, being able to add orders to hand, like our Reign Supreme King of Beasts, just to get some more consistency to find those to further extend. So it just seemed like a nice utility card to kind of help that side of the deck. Only 2 copies because, of course, this one we're not super relying on. I don't think there's enough deck space to justify it. It also doesn't put itself to the bottom of the deck. So I think 2 copies is fine, mostly if you can't find your other counterblasting cards, and just a way to round out your early game to effectively use resources, continue cycling through your deck, continue to find pieces and whatnot. So we'll see how this is. I haven't played too many games with this to really dictate how much I like it. So this is just very much a work in progress, and it's very much a flex slot. So you can run whatever you want, whether it be more Ternars or you want to test something else out. Moving over to the grade 1s, probably the most important one is the Listener of Truth Dindrain here. So Dindrain has 2 effects. When this unit is placed on Rearguard Circle, if you have a Vanguard with only 1 clan, you may Soul Blast 2 to countercharge 1. That effect honestly isn't used too much, but it's still nice to have in case you have excess soul and you really need that counter blast. So it does have some utility, but I'm definitely not pining to Soul Blast 2 to countercharge 1 a lot. It also has some anti-synergy with Ternar, of note, but again, for emergencies, not too bad. But the really strong effect on this card is auto rearguard circle. At the end of battle, this unit boosted. If you have a Vanguard with Ezel in its card name, you may put one other rearguard in the same column as this unit on the bottom of your deck to stand this unit. So this is a really great way to clear up the front row rearguard circle for Ezel, and it also allows us to run these powerful cards like Icirrus and especially the Default here, and still be able to clear up those front row circles with them. So a lot of times I'm just throwing a Default in front of this, bot decking it, restanding this, and now I've got a booster for wherever I call off the Ezel to help me make better numbers. Under Persona Right just makes even better numbers, and even outside of Persona Right, it just makes sure whatever I call can still hit. Maybe not all the time against triggers, but it makes it more likely to be able to hit overall, which is really strong. And the other powerful thing about this card is it is not once per turn. So sometimes you get like a really bad top 7 check where you need to call like a PG or trigger just to aggress, or maybe you're calling a Persona Ride copy. I know this is my Ride deck one, but a Persona Ride copy, and you just want to get that back in rotation for your deck. Dindrain, you can do that. Since it's not once per turn, even if you're not getting more value out of it, sometimes I've just thrown it to the bottom of the deck with a Dindrain, stand it, and just move on, good to go. Especially if they can't intercept, I don't see much reason to leave it out on board. I mean, sometimes it definitely is correct just to make sure you have that body on board to aggress with, but other times, better to do that with. And I really like that flexibility with Dindrain. Another really nice grade 1 for this deck is 4 copies of Silverfane Witch. When this unit is placed on rearguard circle, if you have a grade 3 or greater Vanguard with Gold Paladin for its only clan, this unit gets power plus 5,000 till end of turn, and you can counterblast 1 to draw 1. So this card's super flexible. They easily could have put the 5k in the draw all behind that counterblast, but nope, you can just call it, give it the 5k, and choose not to counterblast. I really like that flexibility with this card. But also just counterblasting 1 to draw 1 is really solid for this deck. Because it filters so much, it makes it easier to find like PGs or shield value or Persona Ride to get into hand. And this deck, especially in the early game, really isn't counterblasting yet because we don't have access to Ezel if your opponent isn't at grade 3 or greater. And the only other counterblast we have is Icirrus. So a lot of times it's just a matter of, do you want to use Icirrus to look at top 3 to try to dig for something specific, or do you want to use Silverfane Witch just to get that +1 to hand? And really, this deck doesn't plus much to hand. You just get your 2 drive checks off of Ezel. So having another card that lets us do that feels so good. And I would even say a lot of times I might even prioritize this over Icirrus because I just want the card in hand in general. So while this is definitely more of a lower power card, doesn't do as much as some of the other cards, it does exactly what it needs to, and it's phenomenal in this deck. A lot of times I'm keeping this in my Mulligan just to be able, once I ride up to Ezel, to call it counterblast 1, draw 1, and just kind of recoup some card advantage, because doing this a pure ride, it's quite expensive since you do have to discard and you don't actually get that card back. It's a pure cost just to be able to accelerate that quickly, and Silverfane, which makes up for that nicely. And of course, running off our grades 1 slot, we've got the PGs running 3 of the Palladium Zeal Dragon, as well as the 1 Elementaria Sanctitude. There are no other Blitzwars I really wanted to run in this deck, so I saw no reason not to run this card. I don't think it'll take away just having that extra unit card to call. You don't really want to call PG, so I don't think it takes away from that. Just having a little extra insurance against maybe the Rogue Stride deck set or grade 4 decks or guard restrict like Flagberg just seems worth it to me. Before moving on to the triggers, I want to discuss the order here, the Reign Supreme King of Beasts, because I feel like this is the big power card that I have not discussed yet. It can only be played if your Vanguard is an Ezel, which no problem. We actually get to this one a bit earlier, but it lets you look at the top 7 cards of your deck, choose up to 1 grade 3 or less unit card from among them, call to rearguard circle, and it gets power plus 5,000 until end of that turn, and you shuffle your deck. So this card, the power is just the cherry on top. This is just, it feels like a free spiritual body condensation a lot of the times, which is really good. But being able to check top 7 means that you can easily find a lot of stuff that you need and just round out your board. It's our crucial card to be able to extend with the default. So a lot of times I either want this in hand, or if I find this off of the order, even better, just lets me go replace this card with a default, which lets me extend to another one. If that finds me a Silverfane Witch, I'm drawing another one. So it can get me up to like +2 in card advantage, which is really solid. And honestly, just filtering out the deck even more is just good by itself. So 4 copies because I want to be using this every single turn to filter out my deck, find my good offensive pieces, my combo enablers such as Dindrain and my defaults. Just every single turn. Oh, and the nice thing is, I know there's another point I was trying to grasp at. Default can actually add this card to hand because it does say if you reveal a normal order, you add it to hand. So sometimes it's purely okay in the early game just to go default. If you find this, add it to hand, set up for next turn so you can build a board, hopefully trigger more defaults. Just kind of keeps the ball rolling, and it feels so good when playing it. It's a really solid card, and I think 4 copies is totally worth it. Surprisingly, haven't actually bricked on the 4 copies yet, but also there's plenty of opportunity in the early game to discard through it and PGs to discard it. So I think it's definitely worth the risk of possibly bricking on it. For the trigger lineup, I run 5 crit, 6 front, 4 heal, of course, and then of course our overtrigger is the Idasfaro, the same ratio that I was running in my preliminary deck list I shared. And I really do like this ratio. Since this deck struggles with numbers, the front triggers feel so good just to be able to put up that pressure. We got the sheer number of attacks to do it, so this makes a lot of sense. And then still 5 crits, because I do think just being able to check crits somewhat consistently to throw off the opponent, balancing between fronts and crits, is still really solid. And really, we're kind of running 6 crits with the Idasfaro here, being able to give a unit +1 crit as well. So we got just a nice balance between the two, which has been running really well for me. Notably, the Blade Feather Dragon here for the crits, because like the Kyrie, we were required to call something off of it. But worst case scenario, if we need to call something off of a card and we don't have any, like we see all triggers and PGs, this one's not a bad one because it can loop itself into Soul to get us some extra value to use an Ezel skill, a default skill, you name it. Though of note, everything except Kyrie is optional. You do not have to call something off of it, so sometimes you might just not want to call it. But if I need to, maybe just rounding out board is worthwhile. I'd rather get the Blade Feather Dragon, and it makes magic numbers with everything except our grade 0s and our Ezels. So a lot of times this will be a fine booster, which is all it really needs to be. So still, I could see an argument for the 5k boosters, but for right now, I think in terms of like a risk versus reward thing, most of the time this card won't even come up. So I figured it would be nice to just have the upside, and I don't think the less power would matter, especially since we're already running the fronts here. Like we're already most likely not going to call critical or triggers if we can help it. But the main other thing to talk about here is the, well, Idasfaro, but also the heals real quick. Right now, I'm just kind of testing, not against any deck in particular, so I have not checked out the heals. You can do so based on the decks you expect to see. And if you don't know, just keep it the 15Ks. I think that is actually optimal when you're not specifically teching for a tournament or a local meta. And then finally, Idasfaro, I like it because it provides a 6 crit for the deck, but also being able to loop back a specific card feels really nice because we have so many great pieces here, whether it be Persona Rides, PG's extra shield value, especially since we don't plus much to hand. I really like this, and I don't think we really need the extra attack with the Valknot. I think most of the time that is pretty negligible. I think it can be, it can matter, but also I like the Idasfaro because it gives me extra flexibility if I check it in the early game. So a lot of times I'm actually having to discard some pretty good cards just because I need to discard so much, especially on turn 2, without necessarily recouping it. So even if I check this early, a lot of times my drop zone has some pretty good stuff to loop back, which feels really great. I also remembered one thing I forgot to mention with Ezel is, even though its effect puts cards to the bottom of the deck, its first effect, its second effect shuffles the deck and will happen before drive checks. So even checking triggers off the top 3 really isn't too bad because sure, we send them all to the bottom of the deck. You don't have to call one. There's been times that I don't, and it's only for a Soul Blast, so it's not too bad, but at least we always have a surefire way to be able to shuffle the deck, and all our searchers actually shuffled the deck except that one skill, so that's not an issue at all. As for the Mulligan, cards I like to see are Persona Ride, because we definitely want to see that to make better numbers, Default, because this is our best extender and best attacker. Even though it doesn't get that 10k until the opponent's at grade 3 or greater, just being able to build a board early on is very solid. Dindrain, of course, because it puts our Default to the bottom of the deck and other cards, so this one's crucial. Depending on the matchup, I'll either hold into hand until I'm ready to enable Ezel's 5 attacks, but if I'm not against a controlled deck, just playing that out can also help round out some numbers. And of course, the Silver Fane, which I think this one's really the main one to keep just because it helps you plus to hand recoup card advantage and dig for these other pieces as well as the early game, as well as just being a 13k attacker or booster is super solid. Kyrie is also not a bad one to keep, but when you're keeping other cards that do what it does but a little better, not always the most optimal one, especially with like the Silver Fang Witch. Most of the time I'd rather use the Silver Fang Witch over the Kyrie. It's more so that I kind of have pseudo 6 copies of Silver Fang Witch, but of course it's not a bad one to keep either. You can always just discard it for Ride deck if you find any of the other cards that are better, and depending on the matchup, of course, you might want to keep a PG. You usually can maneuver your hand to keep one just in case. As for cards you don't want to keep, Bowman, Turnar, and Reign Supreme King of Beasts. I don't tend to keep these cards because we can easily get a Reign Supreme King of Beasts off of the Gareth here, so I don't want to clog up my hand with multiple non-shield value cards. I'd rather just filter out the deck and add it with Default or draw into it myself to be able to use concurrently. Turn R, because this card will not be enabled until the late game, and is better saved for when we have the 3 face down counter blast and we're trying to enable our Ezel's attack in the late game. I think I said that a bit redundantly, but you get the idea. And then Bowman, because again, this card, don't really want to use it until we're trying to clear up rows for the Blond Ezel. It's not bad per se, but I'd rather store it in deck because either I'm having this in a Dindrain or I have to find 2 Dindrains, and especially if I'm against a retire deck or a deck that can get rid of cards on board, I'd rather save these pieces that enable the multi-attack for that late game scenario. As for some final thoughts on this deck, it's a really fun deck. I love how much it kind of filters through the deck, pluses surprises you. It feels so smooth to play, especially once I got it down, how to more optimally play this deck. I don't know if I play it perfect yet, but definitely getting there. And yeah, I definitely recommend trying out if you like a deck that can pull a lot from deck, filter, do multi-attacks. The Superior Ride Rush is pretty cool. I'm still trying to figure out what's optimal, because I realized another thing I forgot to mention, there's so much I want to say about this deck, is that when you go into Blond Ezel going first, you literally prevent your opponent from being able to hit without committing more cards from hand or hitting triggers, because they'll be at 10k, you'll be at 13k. So I'm still trying to balance that out, like how much to actually aggress in the early game, because sometimes it's like I'll have a board and they'll just swing at rear guards because they can actually hit them, and now I'm not getting resources to try to plus my board and they're getting rid of my resources. Sometimes it's fine if I like another Reign Supreme King of Beasts in hand to reload, but sometimes it can get a bit rough, so definitely some testing there to kind of iron out when I should commit versus when I should not. But that again makes the deck fascinating, makes me want to keep playing it. But now I want to hear from you all. What are you running in your Ezel deck? Is there any different techs you're running in your flex slots? Do you disagree with some of my ratios? I love the conversation, as I think it makes us all better deck builders, sharing ideas, discussing what we've noticed, what we've tested, and giving each other new ideas to kind of tinker around with. And if you've enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, and if you haven't done already, please consider subscribing and turning on the notification bell so you're notified when I do upload more Vanguard content. But with that being said though, look forward to more content coming out real soon.